Now we are on another lesson, which is the United Nations and contemporary world governance. So stay tuned and listen and understand what the topic is all about. At the end of this lesson, students should be able to first define global governance, second, identify the roles and functions of the United Nations, and third, determine the challenges of global governance in the 21st century. First and foremost, in order to understand the lesson deeper, we should define these two important concepts. First is governance and government. Okay, governance is simply defined as the act of governing or ruling. So, if it's in English nga process, it is like called a verb because governance is an action of governing or overseeing a particular country. So who governs? So the one who governs a country is called a government. That is why it is called an institution or a group of people who rule or run the administration of a country. So si government ang gagovern. Ang tawag sa power of the government to govern is governance. So as we go on these lessons, we will see how these two concepts are being used. So, moving on. Although many internationalists like Bentham and Kant imagine the possibility of global government, nothing of the sort exists today. There's no organization that various states are accountable to. Moreover, no organization can militarily compel a state to obey predetermined global rules. There is no such a thing that exists today. However, despite there is no existing global government that governs the world, we can see that there is some regularity in general behavior of states or the actions of states toward the world. The book cited this example. States more or less follow global navigational rules as shown in the picture and more often than not respect each other's boundaries. These are often seen as norms. Norms are defined as are accepted codes of conduct that may not be strict law but nevertheless produce regularity in behavior. Although they are not really laws, these norms are binding upon most of the countries. Why? Because using the example cited, the following of global rules is a widespread or usual practices or procedure or custom that the countries of all over the world follow. These things all boils down to what global governance as the manifestation of this sort of global order. Global governance is defined as the process of governing the world with the cooperation of states, intergovernmental organizations, and transnational corporations. We will talk about these actors more as we go on with our lesson. What you should remember is that global governance is existing and possible without necessarily establishing a global government where all states must render submission. To put it simply, if you're a fan of an anime entitled One Piece, if in the anime series there is such a thing as world government that governs the world where Luffy and his crew resides, in reality, contrary to the series, there is no world government that exists. But there is an invisible force or power or authority that governs or rules our world today. Moving on, if there's no such a thing such as world government, then what governs the world? There are four notable sources that governs the world today. First off, treaties and forms organizations. Countries, which we will call states later on, signs treaties and form organizations in the process legislating public international law. Example of these treaties are the GATT, which was discussed in lesson 2, right? It was a treaty signed by 23 states in order to govern their trading with each other. The same treaty became an organization which was then called the World Trade Organization in 1995, right? If you recall, both of which wants to regulate the trading activities of its member states, thus explaining the what we call sources of global governance. Going to the next is lobbying of NGOs. What does it mean? International non-governmental organizations, or NGOs in short, though not having formal state power, can lobby or can influence individual states to behave in a certain way. For example, an international animal protection NGO can pressure governments to pass animal cruelty law, and the list goes on. Furthermore, powerful transnational corporations such as Coca-Cola, Honda, etc., can likewise have tremendous effects on global labor laws, environmental legislation, trade policy, etc. And finally, even ideas such as the need for global democracy or the clamor for global governance can influence the ways international actors behave. Our lesson will not be able to cover the various ways global governance occurs. As such, this lesson will only examine how global governance is articulated by international organizations. It will focus primarily on the United Nations as the most prominent intergovernmental organization of today. When scholars refer to groups like the UN or institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, they usually call them international organization or IOs in short. So what are these? Okay, there are three organizations or classifications of international organizations which are as follows. First, governmental organizations. So these are mainly composed of member states. So in other words, kaning governmental organizations are grupo sa mga nasod. Example, United Nations composed of 100 plus ng mga countries. ASEAN composed of 11 Southeast Asian countries. So again, grupo ni siya sa mga nasod. Next, non-governmental organization or NGO for short. So this is a non-profit group that functions independently of any government. So example, ang Greenpeace. Kaning Greenpeace, ga-advocate ni siya for kanang greener nga life through promoting kanang planting of trees bitaw. Then this World Wildlife Fund organization is of course ang protection sa mga animals. So usually these groups do not belong to any governmental agency. So usually na ni sila tumong nga gusto pagabuhaton nga dili nila munang nagbuhat sila grupo because the government do not usually kanang provide for these advocacies. So going to the last, multinational corporations or MNCs. So these are large corporations which produces or sells goods and services in various countries. So kung si GO, government, si NGO, private nga sector, si MNC is a business sector. Kanang business nga ang iyang scope is worldwide. So example, Coca-Cola. O Coca-Cola, di ba? Famous sa Philippines, but ang Coca-Cola is a worldwide brand. Ang Honda, ang Ford, and the list goes on. So, si MNC is a business na model. This is also still called an international organization. Kaya naman siya influence sa kada countries nga asa siya na-establish or nabutang. One of the major fallacy about international organizations is that it is merely an amalgamation of various interest states or interest. So, ambot pa sa butan ni murag ang usual nga ginahuna na sa mga tao or mga scholars or mga government nga ang mga international organizations kay mura ni siya bulatik bitaw nga ay ilahara mang gusto sa kada state nga moadto sa meeting ang mahitabo sa konsensus. For example, si America most muy powerful ani nga international organization, so iyahara ang push forward. So this is wrong because ang mga international organizations take lives of their own. So you're familiar with UNICEF. Diba? UNICEF advocates on women and child nga protection. This is an international organization which is composed of many member states and many non-governmental organizations. Then usually na mga ambassadors nga ilang gikuha para mag-promote og for example sa UNICEF mag-promote for women and children ng protection. So dili lang siya mere nga meeting ground or talk shops, but naa pud siya kinabuhi, naa siya ay purpose, naa siya ginabuhat. According to Barnett and Fenmore, there are three major powers IOs or international organizations. IOs have the power classification. This is the IO's first power. IOs can invent and apply categories, therefore, they create powerful global standards. For example, it is the UN High Commissioner for Refugees or UNHCR that defines what a refugee is. As such, and since states are required to accept refugees entering their borders, this power to establish identity has concrete effects. Next, IOs have the power to fix meaning. This is a broader function related to the first. Various terms like security or development need to be well defined for states and other non-state actors view IOs as legitimate sources of information. As such, the meanings they have created have various effects on policies. For example, the UN has started to define security as not just safety from military violence, but also safety from environmental harm. So, another very good example is that UN fixes the meaning of gender, diba? As we can really remember, gender refers to male and female, but because of a particular IO, the multinational corporations, to say, uh, explains gender nga dili lang siya exclusive sa male to female but to other sexes like homosexual or heterosexual, etc. So, di ba makita nato usually sa mga ads ni siya, sa mga advertisements, we see nga, this particular IO or MNC promotes gender equality, nga si men pwede ra siya mag-cross-dress, si men pwede ra siya magkuan. Nakita gali nato sa Miss Universe last time nga naay trans woman from Spain nga naka-join. So, because IOs is very global in scope, they can really have tremendous effect on the meanings of such things or in such definitions or such concepts. So, then, powers have the power to diffuse norms. This is a power where IOs spread their ideas across the world, thereby establishing global standards. So, a very good example nga kuan lang, pero dili gyud siya maoy concrete nga example is you're familiar with the three Gs of the Spain. This is a very kanang concrete magud nga example nga makuha nimo siya nga si IO is ga-inculcate og norms. Diba? We know norms not as laws, but they are usual nga behavior. What are these behavior? Liberty or freedom of expression. Diba? We see nga the world is rampaging about we wanted to speak up, we wanted to say something, we wanted to know. So, IOs, much more than the people or the media, can influence or can create norms. Ang democracy gani is an example of a product of what IOs have diffused as a norms. Nga na norms, from norms, nahimo siyang laws, nahimong countries. And most of the countries nowadays are establishing are established under democracy as a norm nga i-follow sa mga countries. So, si IOs creates standards. Now, we're going to talk about the United Nations as a concrete example or as a best example of an institution that facilitates global governance. So you have to remember, karon pa lang daan nga United Nations is not a world government. It's just an institution composed of many states gathered together for a common goal to promote peace, to promote cooperation among themselves. So, again, United Nations just facilitates global governance and the norms that has been followed by its members. Now, we are going to talk about the brief background of the creation of the UN or the context behind the creation of such prestigious and gigantic institution that the world knows today. So, before the father or the mother of United Nations is League of Nations actually. But this League of Nations is a failure kay at the height of the two world wars, si League of Nations failed to stop this. And as a matter of fact, si America unta nga naguna-una og propose nga mag-create og League of Nations, wala ni appeal sa League of Nations. So mo to, nawala ang credibility sa League of Nations kay even ang nag-propose itself kay wala ni join. So at the end of the World War II, nag-end pod ang League of Nations. So now, ang mga countries are worried about another global war. Nahadlok sila nga mag-World War III na pod. You have to remember that this time, grabe na kay ka-devastated ang kalibutan. So, nagunahon na ang mga states nga dili na ni siya pwede may tabo. So, that is why many states began to push for the formation of another institution, more lasting international league nga mas concrete, mas fix, mas powerful kaysa League of Nations nga na-create before. That is why na-create si United Nations out of the mutual nga cooperation or consensus among states nga magbuhat ang inani kay para ma-prevent ang another world war. But at the initial phase of United Nations, mo na yung purpose, i-prevent ang world war. But as the years goes by, ang United Nations nagkaanam og kadaghan ng ihang purpose. So, ana siyang makita ninyo mag-facilitate og mga talks, mag-facilitate og diplomatic meetings. Ba usually makita nato nga gapanghilabot ay gapang di man gapanghilabot gapang na siya say about sa unsay actions sa member states ug sa karon gani favorite kay ta sa UN kay ang atong president si Digong is murag sa ilang paminaw suwail nga anak sa United Nations but more kuan kung ibalik ko na to tong lesson 3 di man doon makapanghilabot sa UN nato because we are a sovereign state but yes they can sanction us wag dira ta padulong nga maluoy. So there are 5 organs of the United Nations. So the biggest one is the General Assembly. The most powerful one is the Security Council. The most kanang elaborate and kanang murag function gyud nga gahuna-huna gyud unsay kanang welfare or development sa ilang member states or sa world itself is ang Economic and Social Council. Then the one who renders or interprets the laws or the rules or the norms or the ordinances nga gina-create sa other agencies of the UN kay gina-interpret sa International Court of Justice and there is what we call secretariat nga nag-facilitate unsaon ni siya pag-take to life ang mga plano or mga proposal sa United Nations. So there are 5. Before there were 6, pero ika-6 was trusteeship council, but giwagtang na siya, although napagyapo ng office, but dili na siya gina-consider as a main organ of the UN. So let us first talk about the General Assembly because it is the UN's main deliberative policy-making and respective organ. So, tanan member states sa UN na ay lingkuranan dinhi nga assembly. So, tanan states are well represented diani. So, as today we have 193 member states, but I think naaiduha, so 195 na siya, naaiduha ka flying, ay ka na mag-unsure nga member, kay dili pa man sila considered nga state. Si Palestine is kina-consider niya yung self nga state ug member sa General Assembly pero dili siya gina-accept, so munang wa siya klaro nga member, pero kung fix lang nga member 193 as of now. So this assembly decides on important questions such as those on peace and security, admission of new members. So, kailangan kung gusto ka magpa-member, for example, si North Korea is not a member of United Nations. If gusto siya magpa-member, kailangan mo agi pa siya aning 193 members. They should, a majority of this, kailangan mo oo nga, okay, no, North Korea, you have to come, you can join pinaagi ani nga members and budgetary matters. So, ang like the Congress of the Philippines, ang Congress of the Philippines, which is composed of the representatives of each kuan man, ang kaning General Assembly, murag Congress, they also decide on budgetary matters. So, unsa may pag-allocate sa funds, pag-decide sa mga subscription sa members, etc. And all these questions require two-thirds majority of the GA or of the General Assembly. So, two-thirds is 1/2 plus 1/4. So, i-divide na lang ninyo na, plus i-divide po ninyo katunga, i-add lang ninyo, that's the vote required para ma-carry out ni ilang mga gusto. So, ang Tibok Assembly is headed by a GA President. Tapos, ang isa ka GA President, 1 year lang ihang term. In the whole history of UN, kausa pag yun nahimong president or GA president sa Philippines. Wala na po nahitabo. Si Carlos P. Romulo lang yun ang nahimong GA president. So, for 1 year rapod, dili siya kuan. So, kailangan mo siya mutual trust from other members. So, usually ra ba dili kayo some countries thinks that our countries are not good enough to lead them, but I think the next Security Council, it is the most powerful organ. Kay most decisions, although we have GA nga 193 members, ang pinaka na ay say sa UN, ang pinaka murag leader sa UN, dili ang GA President, but the Security Council. Security Council has 15 members. Ang pulo ani elected for every 2 years. So, gina-elect sa GA ang 15 members sa Security Council, katong 10. So, tag 2 years po ang ilahang term. So, out of this 15, naapagay 5 kabuok nga pinaka-powerful among members of the United Nations. They are called P5. So, F4 ilang peg, pero 5 na sila buok P5. So, they're composed of China, France, US, United States, United Kingdom, and Russia. Ngano sila man lima, ma'am? Kay sila magud ang victors of the war. Remember, there were 2 world wars? Pagka after sa World War, kung tanan gipang kapoy na, tanan nga samaran, tanan countries na nga daot, kani silang lima, wala ni sila na financially and na financially and kanang politically or wala kay na distract ang ilang country, so munang ginatawag sila victors of the war. So mingon sila naaday kanang kani silang lima ang pinaka power. So the SC take lead in determining the existence of a threat to the peace or an act of aggression. As a matter of fact, the P5 has veto powers. Ang veto powers is basically the power to say no. Pag moingon, ganyan si P5 nga no, no. Bisan pag nag-decide si 193 members nga mugoan ni no jud na. Dili na siya mo-push forward. Ang dili gali required nga silang lima dapat moingon og no. Bisag si China lang maingon og no, wala niingon og no si France, US, UK ug Russia, no gid na. So, mo galing ginatawag ni sila og most powerful countries in UN. Kay isa lang nila kasi no na dayon. So muna, di ba usually as we can see, si China ug si US karon both have P5. So, going back si China og si US karon sige away so munang si UN nagkaguliyang pod kay ang main powerful nga countries kay dili magkauyon. So murag ingon pagali sila na forfeit daw ang purpose sa United Nations kay ang P5 ra man gyapon di ay ang naay say or the Security Council itself. The third main organ is called the ECOSOC or Economic and Social Council. It is the principal body for coordination, policy review, policy dialogue, and recommendations on social and environmental issues, as well as the implementation of internationally agreed development goals. So, currently, there are 54 members elected for a 3-year term, and it is the UN Central Platform for Discussion on Sustainable Development. So, si ECOSOC is tasked to decide, to craft, to make a policy on how nga ang mga member states or the world itself can develop. So, di ba, if you're familiar with the 17 sustainable goals, kanini siya nga goals is product ni siya sa brainstorming and crowdsourcing or survey of the ECOSOC. So, si ECOSOC, ang murag na ay ang task yun nga mag-decide on this. The third one is the International Court of Justice or the ICJ. Its task is to settle in accordance with international law legal disputes submitted to it by states and to give advisory opinions referred to it by states and to give advisory opinions referred to it by authorized United Nations organs and specialized organs. So, there are two international courts actually. Kailangan ma-distinguish ninyo unsay kalahian ni ICJ or International Court of Justice from International Criminal Court. So si ICJ, ang iyang pwede ra gyud i-try or i-hear nga ang case is ang case sa states. So ang country mismo represented by consuls, diplomatics, or the president itself, ang iyang itry. On the other hand, si ICC, ang iyang ginatry, or International Court of Justice, tries persons. So, ang iyang gina-hear niya cases is cases involving persons. So, you remember nga sa news before, tungod kay si UN nang handlo kan Duterte ngayon siya nga kung dili gali nimo na undangan ng extrajudicial killings or kanang product sa tokhang amo kang pakasuhan. So asa man siya i-try? Dili siya i-try sa ICJ, i-try siya sa ICC. So dili pod actually ang downside lang aning ICJ ug ICC kayang i-try ang iyang i-hear lang ang case is ang katong mga member states. So, kay bright mo kayo si Digong, nihawa ta sa ICC. So munang, at the end of his term, there's a big chance na ipatawag siya sa ICC because of extrajudicial killings. Pero I doubt nga lisod kaayo because we are no longer part of the ICC. Even the ICJ, ang atong kaso sa Spratly Islands between China, Malaysia, Vietnam, and other countries nga nag-ilog sa katong Kalayaan Group of Islands, dili to siya sa ICC gitry. Gitry to siya sa ICJ, state concern man. Again, ICJ tries state concern, ICC tries person. If you're familiar with the King of Coke, si Pablo Escobar, na siya Netflix na series, si Pablo Escobar, moto siya ang pinakamurag famous na gitry sa ICC. Kay, likely gong bright pud kaayo nga president of Argentina ba to? Argentina. Ang katong lugar, ay Colombia. Colombia is ni dato kayo during his time. Tingala ang mga silingan nga nasud nganong dato kaayo ang Colombia. Ang ginabuhat day sa ni Pablo Escobar is gabaligya siya sa black market og coke. Coke is short for cocaine. So ang kwarta nga na profit from cocaine is gina-fund niya sa iyang state. So mo to ganahan kay mga people sa iya kay actually dato kayo but dato kayo ang state nila but in the eyes of the international community dili to maayo. So mo to yang gibuhat for dili siya mahilabtan or dili siya walay ebidensya nga makuha sa iyaha, ihang gisunog iyang tibuok balay along with other evidences. But still, gitry gyapon siya sa ICC o gipatawan og pagkamatay. If you want to know about him, you watch the Netflix series about Pablo Escobar, the King of Coke. The last organ is the UN Secretariat. So it is composed of the Secretary General and tens of thousands of international UN staff members who carry out the day-to-day work of the UN as mandated by the GA and the organization's principal organs. In other words, it is the UN staff. So they carry out the works of the UN. So daghan kini sila nga members. So what are the challenges that the United Nations should face? So first one is the P5 itself. Because the P5 has enormous powers on their pockets, so munang nag-cause ra pud siya og challenge sa UN. Kay when there is a disagreement between or among the P5 nga members, magkaguliyang jud. For example, gusto ni gusto ni US before gusto ni US nga atakihon si Iraq because Iraq is kanang in the eyes of the US is kanang suwail bitaw barok nga nasod. So gusto niya murag i-penalize ang Iraq through military nga force. But dili niya mahimo tungod kay ingon si Russia nga no. Di ba? You have to remember that the P5 has the veto powers. They have the power to say no. Sumuto, ang ending, they have diplomatic na noon nga away si US ug si Russia. And now, another example is katong si China ug si US, di ba? They have trade war. Before, the news is filled with katong Huawei nga case and the Google. Oh, that's another example nga dili magkauyon ang China ug ang US. So na siya impact sa UN itself. So when the P5 itself, although they are powerful, they can help the UN. Mao po'y nahimo kung possible nga challenge sa UN. Another is the rise of military insurgency. So sometimes there are distrust among members. And of course, if dili gali nila ma-forward ang ilang gusto via diplomatic nga means, mo resort gyud sila og arms nga means or military nga means. So that alone poses a threat sa structure sa UN. Kay if ang member gani nag-start na siya og kanang being insurgent, so what do you think will happen sa whole organization? So muna, as as much as possible, the UN is containing such insurgencies. And that's it.